name is Tanya and I'm the founder of Vivid Foundry, as Izzy very kindly introduced me. And unfortunately, okay, there we go. My slides are in front of me here today. And what I'll be covering is such an expansive topic in many ways that 25 minutes, I hope I can only, cover just a little bit, just so that if you're interested in developing more within the space, or you're already creating within the space, that hopefully we can have a further discussion on this topic. So one of the elements of this is, why socially conscious games? Why is this something that we should be considering in our game making space? It's not very common, first off, I'll state this, and second of all, there are a number of challenges associated with it. And one of the reasons that I decided to, I have slides. One of the reasons that I decided to name the topic about disruption. Oh, am I projecting better now? Okay, great. One of the reasons that it's about disruption to me is that I want to seize this word back. A lot of the times when we hear about disruption in, for example, today's branding, it has to do a lot about the convention among multinational corporations to fetishize like the erosion of laws in order to engage in kind of a certain profit margin. And I think when we want to work against that for socially conscious works, we really want to take back the word disruption and really actualize a vision of engaging with positive change that connects with marginalized groups to include them in the conversation. So some of the strategies that I think are very beneficial towards that would be engaging with the community through, for example, through library programs and through different community groups that happen to be working with welfare of the of certain individuals and groups. Another one would be lowering risks and barriers to people who are marginalized. Third one would be to help them develop a voice, or to help a certain community that you're part of to really develop a voice. And I think that's the way that we can take back away from certain ideas that really cultivated in a very kind of corporate sense, where it often increases the risk, such as very big crowdsourcing economies and so forth, where the risk is really on the people who are already inhabiting quite a lot of risk and can suffer quite a lot of loss. So in this case, games are actually the perfect place to engage with this, because it is a ludic engagement with storytelling at intersections where the player self-inserts. And so you have players who then, through games, they can also create their own voices and talk about it in a very different way because of the state of interaction in games. So how do we start? For me, in my own practice, I start with a kind of passion, like what kind of story do I want to talk about? And a lot of this, I'll just summarize very quickly so I can get through all of the slides, is that it has to be something that you're willing to engage with a kind of deep research into. And I'll go more into that in terms of how I happen to define deep research. It's another thing where you yourself feel challenged by. So a lot of the times it can be something where when I'm accessing something, I am passionate about it, but I know that I don't have all of the answers. And it also can be something that you're familiar with, but you want to be at the same time challenged. So I don't necessarily see these as exclusive to one another. I see them as kind of comprehensively working together. And games can be actually designed in a way so that players do find themselves in a very open-ended space to really ask questions and to offer solutions of their own. And that's, I think, the beauty of game development in many ways, that players really sense if you're engaged with that kind of those questions in mind because you're very passionate about it. So that's a key aspect that I really think is really exciting within game spaces that might be going into more difficult topics that are not necessarily engaging with fun. And I think this is kind of a great environment for us to discuss this, because we're dealing with all sorts of new technologies that might not necessarily have an existing language that we can actually delve into, or existing conventions. Okay, so on to the next slide. I'm just going to go through some kind of game design 101, and hopefully this isn't too simplistic for some of you in the room who are very familiar with game practices. Three kind of elements of which game design can be useful towards socially conscious games, three frameworks, is thinking of how you lead in terms of design. So you can lead with designing for fun. You can lead with designing for kind of like a real-world simulation of something that already existed, or you can design from a kind of narrative-centric perspective. So you can start with a narrative first. You can start with something that you know is going to create adrenaline rush for your players, or you can develop something where it is very much embedded in a kind of strategization around interfaces. So some of the examples for fun would be Mario. The Mario games are very good at engaging people through fun. SimCity would be a great example in terms of like AAA titles of simulation. And then furthermore, you have Telltale's games are very much led by the story. So they design first, having written, for example, a storyline, and then all of the gameplay flows from that. So I just wanted to make that kind of distinction. And of course, we see this kind of similarity with game design in the social conscious element sense. And by that, I mean things that engage with politics or social concerns. Here, a few examples from more indie games would be Never Alone, done by E-Line Games, which is a story about, it's a platform game, so it engages with fun in that respect. You play as a young girl who's part of the Inuit community going on a spirit journey with her fox spirit, and then in between each chapter you actually do get a sense of the communities living in these areas and talking about their culture. It's a very evocative game for that reason, but it also engages with conventional game mechanics. You have Papers, Please as a good simulation, and also Democracy 3, which is the topmost image, and which simulates a kind of, for Democracy 3, it simulates kind of a democratic structure before elections and so forth. And finally, you have, as a game-driven, a narrative-driven game at the far right, you have the game 1979 Revolution, Black Friday, which is about the Iranian Revolution. And so you get dialogue choices built into these games. Each one of them plays very differently. For 1979, for example, you are working with ethical choices. So just a breakdown of that is, it doesn't load on my screen, so. You have essentially a wealth of resources for creating narrative stories. Sorry, let me just see if I can refresh this. Whereas for game-centric let me just go back to the fun games. For fun games, you might be accessing a really large group of players that are already within your game market, essentially, whereas for narrative games, it's a much smaller market. Sim games tend to attract people who very much enjoy strategy, for example, so it's a different kind of direction when you're designing your first games. So one of the elements of design, if you're designing your first game, is what kind of an experience do I want to create, and what kind of scope do I necessarily want to entail? And by scope, I really mean the vision and execution all together combined. Do you want to tell a long story, or do you want to tell something that hits the player all at once within just 20 minutes and really start engaging them from that moment that, hey, this is a political game, or this is a this is something of a very small socio-political concern that you can then extrapolate to larger kind of situations as well. So a lot of that has to do with the premise, the scope. So one example in my own work is essentially I had a VR game which is only about 20 minutes long. It's called Eviction Notice, and the scope of that is very small. The only premise is a young woman who goes to essentially, she is being forcefully politically evicted from her home, and so she's packing everything away. And so you get this erosion of culture happening within the space that becomes emptier and emptier. And so for that, it's a very small scope compared to something which is a little bigger, which is my commercial game called Solid State, which is what I'll show as a trailer. The volume for this is very quiet. There's no audio, right? Oh. They were no longer articulate. It's time to demands and civic muscle. I can try. Taught me not to fear change. It's not change I fear. Leaving a trace. You don't hurt anyone with this, really. It's so powerful that can propel us to guard our breaths, bodies, and hearts for fear of. Okay. Thank you. Just so that I can have that as an illustration, a lot of the footage in the trailer is actually in-game footage. And so from that, why did I decide to make solid state design narrative-centric, starting from the script first and then building the game mechanics around it rather than the other way around? Part of that is because the overall premise of the game, hopefully you can hear a little bit of it, is essentially coming to social consensus. You really want to engage the characters within the game, despite that they come from completely different backgrounds, to come to a kind of agreement so that they can essentially rise up from oppression. And so a lot of that is engaging with a lot of conversations with fictional characters in order that you know, one person might have a lot of stake in a financial situation, another person might be completely out of a job, that somehow you're able to navigate in that very difficult space to see if everyone can come out to declare for their rights, essentially. So a lot of that meant that I had to start with the story first and then build a lot of the mechanics around that, and that includes how much am I reading, how often is the player going to read things, because we actually did try designing once where it was more of a stealth mechanic, and so you're wandering around and people are then anticipating essentially that, hey, I need to hide from certain NPCs. But no, the overall element of this particular game is that we want people to talk to the NPCs. So there was a kind of cognitive dissonance to some of the people who were testing the game, that they thought, hey, I'm going to get a jump scare soon. But instead, it's actually, we wanted to move away from that kind of convention. So in terms of design, that's kind of I'm generalizing a lot, but that's the direction that we wanted to go with it. A lot of the times, it's like the primary driver behind the design for what I've experienced is essentially, what do you want the player to focus on the most? Are you going to have them engage with fun? Are you going to engage them with learning different systems in terms of building out a kind of simulation of what it would be like in real world scenarios, such as very kind of complex strategies around different balances and so forth? Or are you actually going to create a kind of story-driven experience where player choice really matters and the player really wants to engage with different ethical considerations and really pull from it into their own lives? So that's some of the elements that you kind of have to adjust around. So this leads directly into the idea of creating diverse characters and spaces. One of the things that we really wanted to focus on in developing Solid State as a visual novel is really create an imaginary environment, an imaginary city really that has a lot of diverse characters, and that includes like people of different races and creeds and so forth, even if it happens in a completely imaginary space. And so one of the, what has helped me in that particular context is to ask the question of whether an imagined nationality, for example, can consider itself unified. And most of the times I would say, no, it's never completely like unified. There's no unilateral like national understanding of a place for everybody in the same way. It's not monolithic in that way. And then the question becomes why? Why are some of the minorities in this particular even imaginary city space thinks that it's the city might not be for me. So one of the elements is that if I don't know the answer to that, even for an imaginary character or someone of a kind of racial, who has a kind of racial background, is then I have to go into research sources. And of course that can come in the form of books, other forms of media and journalism, and sometimes it's going into discussion groups, whether it's in person or mostly online. But the most important thing for me so far has been in interviews and consultation. And the interviews, oftentimes, I've accessed mostly politicians and activists. A lot of these people, surprisingly, if you reach out to them and you really formulate like a legal or like a plan to say like exactly how the information will be used, they'd be happy to speak to you, over lunch or something. That's been at least my personal experience, because they want their voices to be heard in some capacity. So a lot of individuals were very willing to speak to me on that kind of, as long as I show them clearly what my aims are with this particular project. Another form is through consultation. That's also not very costly, and that's through oftentimes consultancy groups who get me in touch with people's experiences that I'm not necessarily familiar with personally. Unfortunately, I only have 5 minutes left, but I'll try to go through this really quickly. An aspect of this is, of course, to not have minority characters essentially be the support cast of a particular, often most dominant character, and that could be the white cis male character, or if you happen to be doing it in, for example, an East Asian state, it's the representative of the most, wealthy, powerful group in that particular category. So a lot of the times it's making sure that these characters have their own motivations, and really telling a story that, if they're helping the main character, it's the main character's journey, of course, that you really do push in a particular direction of including also their own goals as well. They're not going to give up their own community just to help the main character. That's absurd. In many ways. And we're similarly, minority groups are also not just their trauma, they're bigger than that. And I think that's something that's I'm still seeing too little of in current media. So it's all about just showing human motivations as you would for the protagonist in different ways. I have to skip this next slide, but it's a number of tools. I'd be happy to talk to you about this over lunch or any other time or via social media. It's the most important slide, probably. But I almost feel there's a lot of information online about that, but I'd be happy to talk about. And the last slide, I think, is also really important, mostly because it kind of comes from the learning that I've experienced myself, which is in creating internal expectations to build essentially what's a good team. And a lot of that I think has to do with setting up certain kinds of expectations because socially conscious games aren't popular. They're not, the big money makers as much as I'd like to consider otherwise. And so some people might be in it for fun, and we have to kind of respect that. I'm building a career out of this in terms of for professionalism. So I have a certain kind of set expectations that this is going beyond, for example, just a fun weekend thing that I'm, as a hobbyist. So a lot of the times, in terms of working with a team, what's worked well for me is coming to consensus using a lot of game design docs and really referring back to it so that you always have an outline of what you want to achieve, and always going back to looking at the core vision of that. I've worked better in kind of hierarchical structures where I'm bringing on board other people to kind of reach a particular type of vision. And it's having systems where you're actually checking in with people in terms of their goals, but also having overlapping processes so that well ahead of a deadline. Essentially, these are kind of basic tools, but sometimes it doesn't get repeated for some reason in the game industry. It's that you have certain processes where you do a check-in much before a certain deadline, just in case that there are any kind of limitations to that. I find that actually I want to start with the legal documentation and agreement very early on in the process, almost within, as long as I want to work with you, I want to push forth with essentially bringing on a lawyer to discuss, hey, this is the areas of a contract, for example. Most of the time, because I think it sets the right kind of tone and standard towards future collaboration, because the overall kind of direction of kind of protecting everyone's rights on the team can start with that, including that of intellectual property, essentially assignments, and so on and so forth. And all of these elements that I think can really engage the party in kind of to bring together in a consensus. One element is really to hire slow and fire fast. I find that a lot of times there's not, sometimes there might not be a commitment towards that particular vision, and that's okay. The element of essentially, it sounds so strict in certain ways, the hiring fast or the hiring slow and firing fast. But there's a sense of if someone on the team can't necessarily grow with my company, then it's best that I essentially let them go so that they can grow elsewhere. And I think that's the most kind of compassionate way that I can help someone with my team, so that essentially my team doesn't fall apart because I have to be responsive at the end of the day to create a certain product. And it's also a lot of self-care too, and extrapolating that further past within a particular kind of just myself, and really sharing that self-care as a culture within the work environment that I'm building, to give myself space, to not respond to naysayers on social media, and to realize that no matter how personal the socially conscious message is, no matter how passionate you are about it, at the end of the day, the concept is still a professional product. And so the conduct always has to be professional amongst all team members. So that's one thing that I think sometimes it's easy to get into the headspace of, oh, this is just a dream that we wanted to create. But we to have to be responsive to each other as well. So thank you so much. Oh, great, okay, I thought I was looking at the slides only on my end, but thank you so much. If you want to reach me, you can find me on social media with Instagram as well as Twitter at my handle, Vivid Foundry, and I look forward to continuing the conversation with you. Thank you.